Are you tired of not being able to convert positions when you're up in space? In today's video, we'll be talking about space advantage, what it is, what you should avoid, and various principles that will help you navigate positions when you have more or less space. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. First things first, let's start by discussing what space advantage is. Space advantage in chess is when you're controlling more squares than your opponent. The way you gain space is by pushing specific pawns for a specific purpose. Space can be gained either in the center of the board or on the flank, either with a4, a5 or h4, h5. We will talk more about this later on in the video. And the purpose of space is that it gives your pieces more space to move, more room to move around, and it gives your opponent's pieces less room to move around, and they are a bit more restricted. Even if the knights go to either f6 or c6, you always have the option of kicking them out. You don't have to do it right away, but you always have the option to do so. Space has other utilities as well. For example, if you have space in the center of the board and you have both of these pawns pushed to d4 and e4, you get to dictate where the game goes. You can at any point play e5 and choose to play on the king side, or play d5, gain space on the queen side, and then play more positionally over there, or you can choose to simply develop. This is the best option right now. You can decide where to go later on in the game, or you can keep the tension in the center of the board and try to play in the center of the board by opening it up. Now let's talk about the most important principle when it comes to the space advantage. I'm going to show you how powerful space advantage can be in chess, and I'm going to show you a practical example of that. So after a move like d4, let's say black plays c5, this is called the Benoni. It's one of the openings in d4 positions. I'm not going to talk about all the details, but I'm going to talk about what's going on generally in the position, and we get a position like this. Knight to d2 is one of the sidelines, it's not the main line, but what I want you guys to notice about this position is that white has more space. Let me just make two more moves, castle and bishop to e2. In this position, white is the only one whose pawns have crossed the middle line. The middle line is between the 4th and the 5th rank, and the only pawn that has crossed that and went into the opponent's territory is this pawn on d5. Now, why is this pawn on d5 useful? First and foremost, it controls c6, so the knight cannot be developed to c6, so this knight on b8 does not have a good developing square, and also this bishop right here does not have a good developing square on e6. So already we can see that black is struggling to develop. Black bishop also cannot be developed to g4 because of how well controlled it is, and later on white will play h3 to further reinforce that. So these two pieces, the bishop and the knight, are going to be competing with each other, who occupies this square on d7, who needs to be developed, because both of them cannot stand on d7. They cannot stand on one square at the same time, so one of these two pieces will have to get lost behind, at least for a little while. So in this position, black plays a6. Black is attempting to gain space on the queen side. White stops that with a4. Let's say knight to d7, castles, rook to e8, and then queen c2 played here by white, further protecting the pawn, and then queen c7 just developing the queen, knight to c4, and then knight to e5 chosen by black. And here we get to the very, very, very important principle when it comes to space. When you're the side that has more space in chess, you want to avoid trading pieces. So for example, with knight e5, black is offering an exchange of the knights. You do not want to trade any pieces off the board, because the whole purpose of space is to restrict opponent's pieces. If you trade off the opponent's pieces, there will be nothing left to restrict. So you need to avoid trades as much as possible, and in this position the correct move is this move, knight to a3, avoiding this trade with the knight on e5. Knight e3 is not exactly possible, because if knight to e3 is played, then black will play knight to g4, and this knight will still get traded off, and actually in this case black equalizes, which is quite interesting in a position like this. So the correct move is to go to a3 and not allow the knights to be traded off. Let's say black continues with b6 to go bishop to b7 and to bring the rook or something. Here we will just simply simply continue developing with white. We will play f4 to kick this knight out without allowing it to trade. And then eventually what will happen is that this knight will go back to c4 at some point, like right now, for example. I know I just made a lot of moves on the board right now, but all of these were just like simple developing moves, nothing crazy, moving the king out of the way and bringing the pieces into play. But the idea that I'm trying to illustrate is that white is trying to avoid any piece trades, and black really does not have anything. Black is playing h5, h4. What do you do here with the black pieces? If you go b5, you are sacrificing material. So where else are you supposed to get a pawn break and open up your rooks with the black pieces? If you play f5, that's also not going to work. First and foremost, the knight is in the way, so you would have to move the knight away. But where do you move the knight? If you go to h5, you get taken. That's why h5 is so important. And then h4 just simply becomes a target, and then bishop e1 can easily target it, although black is trying to defend, of course. And this is the advantage of having a lot of space, is that your opponent, in this case black, does not have any good plan in this position, and you can go knight to c4 attacking this pawn, and black is just simply on the defensive. It's so difficult to find a move here for the black pieces because there is no good move, there is no good plan to further activate your pieces. You're on the back foot. And in this case, after bishop to d3, let's say black plays this move b5. Finally black gets a pawn break. Okay, fine, we will capture, and then we will capture on b5. We will sacrifice two knights, and we will take this very powerful pawn on d6, and then after, let's say, the queen captures back here, we will capture the rook. And even though some pieces do get traded off, we still don't want to trade too many pieces, and we have the huge center. We can go e5, and this is an overwhelming advantage for white because all of black's pieces are so well restricted. This pawn is still weak, this pawn will eventually also be weak, and the huge space favors the white pieces because all the minor pieces are still on the board. Therefore, this position is winning for the white pieces. So the main point here, let me just go back to the critical position. This is the critical position right here. What do you do here? This is where you need to figure out that you have more space, and you need to make the decision of not trading the pieces off. You can trade the knight and still claim some advantage, but it is significantly better to go back to a3 and avoid any trades altogether. So this is the most important principle. When you have more space, avoid trades. When you have less space and you're on the defending side, trades favor you. Just to illustrate, having space advantage and having space are two very different things. So for example, in this position, white has space advantage because white is restricting black's pieces. However, if we change the position a little bit, actually not even a little bit, if we change the position a lot and get rid of all the minor pieces, now there's no more space advantage because there are no more pieces to restrict. And if anything, black is the one that's firing over here and white is the one that is getting pressured. So your pawns that give you space during the early opening phase in the middle game can become overextended in the end game if used incorrectly. This will not always happen if you use your pawns correctly. However, if you don't use them correctly, then they will be overextended and easily targeted by your opponent's pieces. Of course, Benoni is not the only opening where space advantage is relevant, and Caro-Kann is another example. Especially the advanced Caro-Kann is an example where space advantage is something that white is trying to use to beat black. And one of the most popular variations to play against the Caro-Kann is called the short variation with knight f3 and then bishop to e2 by white. And what white is trying to do here is just simply avoid trading pieces. There is a specific reason why did not play bishop to d3. That is because this trade benefits black, not white, because black is the one that's lacking space and black is the one that wants to trade pieces off. Therefore, black wants white to play bishop d3 and not bishop to e2. There's actually another reason why this move order is better, like this move order right here is better rather than playing knight to f3 and then playing e5, because here bishop to f5 is not something that black's gonna going to play. Black will play bishop g4, pinning the knight, and now black gets a very similar opening, but with a different move order. Instead of the bishop being on f5, it is on g4, and this slight change benefits black just a tiny bit, but it makes the game significantly easier to play for the black pieces. Therefore, this position is just simply easier to play. That is why masters don't usually play knight f3 here. They play this move order with d4 and then play knight f3 and bishop to e2 later on, because this allows white to keep all the pieces on the board. And as a matter of fact, one of the variations here is to go back to g6 with the bishop just to put the knight on f5 and then pressure d4 that way. This is another variation, and if the bishop was on g4, you would not have to move this bishop back to g6 in order to do that. Of course, you don't have to play this right away. You can do some other things, but this is just one of the lines that I wanted to showcase as well. You going back and putting the knight on f5 because these two pieces get in each other's way. So you want to avoid this as much as possible if you're playing this from the black side, and once again try to restrict your opponent if you're playing this from the white side and you want to win the game. Try to not trade pieces off and keep the tension as much as possible. We can see yet another example of space advantage in the French defense. So for example, after e4, e6, d4, d5, if we just go a couple of moves down the road, what you will realize that in the advanced French, this is one of the variations of the French defense, black is lacking in space. Black is struggling to develop his pieces here, but the way black fights back is with a6, with c5, and then trying to play on the c file. So this is another example where one side is very cramped and is lacking in space. And in positions like this, of course, all the same rules still apply. You still want to trade some pieces off, but mainly you want to focus on trading off your bad pieces. So for example, you need to trade off this light square bishop, this French bishop that is usually very bad. If you just simply continue playing normally and then you, let's say, take on d4 and then trade a pair of knights here and you expect to be equal, that's not exactly going to be the case, because you still have this weak piece on c8. So I would still prioritize trading off weak pieces and not trading meaninglessly. For example, you don't have to take here on d4 right away. This is a very decent knight, and this exchange doesn't necessarily benefit you right away, but trading this bishop off would benefit you. So if you were to wait a little bit and then go with the moves like knight to c5, bishop d7, and just continue developing like this, eventually what will happen is that you will be able to trade this dark square bishop off, maybe on b5 or maybe someplace else. However, I would still prioritize, once again, trading off weak pieces rather than just generically trading off all the pieces. You can also take space on the flank, such as with moves like h4 and then try to play h5. Then the goal here is to attack the black king because it is opposite side castling and you're trying to open up this side of the board. However, it can also be used positionally in slightly different positions. Let's say this one right here. Here you can take more space with the moves like a4, a5, and the goal is to activate your rook on a1 without having to move it at all. So in this position, let's say black replies with f5, okay, you would simply capture on e5 and then you would bring the rook, get a tempo on the queen, and then play this move a5. Now you're able to activate this rook because you pushed this pawn, you took space on this side of the board. You're also able to go rook a4 if you need to. In any situation, you can go rook a4 to go over here, or maybe in the future over here. It's very unlikely, but okay, maybe there's some reality where that's possible. So because you took this space, you have this option of lifting the rook as well. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is that the space you take on the flank will be useful later on. Actually, it's not exactly the space. In reality, it's just the fact that the pawns have been fixed and the pawn on a7 is going to be weak. The space is very useful in the middle game phase of the game. However, in the end game, such as in this position right here, this space in the a file, it's not really that relevant. What is relevant is the fact that there's a weakness on a7 and you can target it it with a move like knight to b5, and there's no way to defend the pawn on a7. So despite the fact that this space in itself is no longer useful, the fact that you push this pawn up the board in order to take space, this pawn became useful for a different reason, and this is something else that can happen later on in the endgame where this pawn will become weak. Let me show you a very similar example, such as in this one right here. In this one, the position is still equal. It's 4 pawns versus 4. However, this pawn on h7 is very weak, and you have to be very, very, very careful with the black pieces to not lose this position. For example, the best move here is to play this move e4, and the only move here, the only move that draws the game is this move king to e7, which looks crazy because it straight up just allows rook h8 and you lose this pawn on h7, but you have to allow this and you have to give up this pawn, and then you have to apparently play rook a4, and somehow the computer can't even really see whether this position is a draw or a win for the white pieces. It is going back and forth. It cannot decide whether it's a draw or a win. However, one thing is clear: white is at the bare minimum much better in this position. So this pawn push of h4, h5, h6 that white did earlier on has become very useful later on in the game. Once again, the space itself is no longer as useful here because you don't need this h-file space anymore. However, the fact that you push the pawn to h6 has created a weakness on h7. White is now able to utilize that to his advantage, and he's able to capture this pawn. If you play any other move other than king e7, let's say you play g5 to go king g6, what white will do is play e5, and then rook g8 is going to lead to mate in 2 with something like this. So you cannot exactly do that. There's not much you can do. You will still have to go back, and you will still lose this pawn, and you will still lose the pawn on h7 with moves like rook h8, rook h7, and this is going to be a winning position for the white pieces.